One general's plan nearly tore the Allied command apart from within. Clashing egos, bitter rivalries, a command structure on the edge of collapse. What made Montgomery's narrow front so controversial? Why did Eisenhower refuse to back down? How did national pride fuel the divide? The answer reveals a hidden battle, one fought not against the enemy, but among allies themselves. Montgomery's narrow front strategy. Montgomery had a bold vision. He believed the war could end by Christmas 1944. His plan was simple but risky, one massive strike straight into Germany's heart. He called it the narrow front approach. Instead of spreading forces thin across multiple areas, Montgomery wanted all Allied strength concentrated in one powerful thrust. British and Canadian forces would lead the charge across the Rhine River, driving deep into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial center. If they captured this region and pushed to Berlin, the enemy would collapse. But there was a catch. Montgomery demanded something controversial. Every available soldier, tank, fuel truck, and supply crate had to go to his 21st Army Group. No sharing, no compromises. Other Allied commanders would have to wait. This wasn't just a military strategy, it was a gamble that required total trust and total control. Eisenhower, the supreme commander, wasn't convinced, and that's where the trouble began. But why did Eisenhower see this plan as dangerous? Eisenhower's broad front strategy. Eisenhower had a different vision entirely. He didn't believe in putting all resources into one single strike. Instead, he favored what he called the broad front strategy, advancing Allied forces simultaneously along the entire Western Front. Why? Because it used the Allies' greatest advantage, overwhelming numbers and supplies. By attacking everywhere at once, the Germans couldn't focus their defenses in one place. They'd be stretched too thin to hold any line effectively. Eisenhower also believed Montgomery's narrow front was too risky. What if that single strike failed? The Allies would lose momentum, supplies, and lives, all for nothing. He had proof, too. Operation Martingarten, Montgomery's ambitious airborne operation in the Netherlands, had failed, with devastating losses. Eisenhower saw that failure as evidence that concentrated strikes were unreliable. But Montgomery refused to accept this reasoning. He believed Eisenhower lacked the military experience to understand battlefield strategy. The two leaders were heading toward an inevitable clash. And Montgomery wasn't shy about expressing his opinions. Montgomery's arrogance. Bernard Montgomery was brilliant, and he knew it. Monty, as he was called, had a reputation for winning battles, but he also had a monumental ego. He believed his ideas were superior to everyone else's, and he wasn't afraid to say so. Montgomery often ignored the opinions of fellow commanders, insisting his strategies were the only path to victory. This didn't sit well with American generals. George Patton despised him. Omar Bradley grew frustrated with his constant demands and dismissive attitude. Montgomery openly criticized American leadership in meetings, calling their tactics wasteful and their commanders inexperienced. He wanted full control of Allied ground forces, sidelining Eisenhower's authority. His arrogance created tension that went beyond military disagreements. It became personal. American commanders felt disrespected. British leaders, meanwhile, supported Montgomery's confidence, seeing it as decisive leadership. But confidence and arrogance are two different things, and Montgomery's refusal to compromise was about to make things much worse, because the British High Command shared his doubts about Eisenhower.
Perceived inexperience. Eisenhower was supreme commander of all Allied forces in Europe, but many British leaders didn't think he deserved the role. Montgomery and Chief of the Imperial General Staff Alan Brooke believed Eisenhower lacked real battlefield experience. Yes, he was a skilled organizer and diplomat, but was he a true strategist? British commanders doubted it. They saw him as someone who managed politics, not combat operations. Montgomery believed he should be leading ground forces, not taking orders from someone he viewed as militarily inexperienced. This created a serious problem. Eisenhower needed cooperation from all his commanders to succeed, but the British weren't fully cooperating. They questioned his decisions, they challenged his authority, they pushed their own strategies instead of following his directives. This wasn't just about military tactics anymore, it was about trust. And without trust, an army cannot function. Eisenhower tried to keep the peace, but Montgomery's constant challenges made that nearly impossible. Then, Montgomery made a move that almost ended his career. Boastful press conferences. After the Battle of the Bulge, Montgomery held a press conference. It was supposed to reassure the public that the Allies had stopped Germany's surprise offensive. Instead, it turned into a disaster. Montgomery took credit for saving the Allied cause. He spoke as if British forces under his leadership had rescued the Americans from defeat. He barely acknowledged the sacrifices of U.S. soldiers who had fought and fallen in brutal winter combat. American commanders were furious. Patton wanted Montgomery removed immediately. Bradley threatened to resign if Montgomery wasn't disciplined. Eisenhower faced enormous pressure from Washington to relieve Montgomery of command. The press conference wasn't just arrogant, it was politically explosive. It confirmed every American suspicion that the British viewed them as inferior partners. Churchill himself had to intervene, forcing Montgomery to issue a reluctant apology. But the damage was done. The divide between American and British commanders had never been deeper. And this divide wasn't just about egos, it was about power. Manpower and influence. By late 1944, the balance of power in the Allied command had shifted dramatically. American forces in Europe vastly outnumbered British troops. The United States was supplying most of the equipment, fuel, and reinforcements. Britain, exhausted after 5 years of war, was running low on soldiers. British leaders realized they were losing influence. If the Americans dominated the war effort, Britain's voice in future decisions would fade. Montgomery's push for a British-led narrow front wasn't just military strategy, it was political survival. If British forces delivered the decisive blow that ended the war, Britain would remain a major player in post-war Europe. But if the Americans led the final victory, Britain risked becoming a secondary power. Churchill and his military chiefs understood this. They supported Montgomery not just because they believed in his strategy, but because they needed Britain to stay relevant. This political maneuvering created deep mistrust among Allied commanders. And there was another reason the British hesitated to commit fully: casualty aversion. Britain had been fighting since 1939. By 1944, the nation was drained. Millions of young men had already served. Casualties from earlier campaigns, Dunkirk, North Africa, Italy, had taken a heavy toll. The British public and government were increasingly sensitive to further losses. Britain simply didn't have the manpower reserves that America possessed. Every fallen soldier was irreplaceable. This reality shaped British military strategy. Montgomery's cautious approach reflected this concern. He refused to risk his forces in operations he deemed too dangerous. American commanders, by contrast, had access to fresh reinforcements. They could afford to take risks and absorb heavy losses because replacements were available. This difference created friction. Americans saw British caution as timidity. The British saw American aggression as reckless. Neither side fully understood the pressures the other faced, and this misunderstanding deepened the divide, making cooperation even harder as the war entered its final phase. So what ultimately came of this bitter division?
The lasting division. The friction between Montgomery and Eisenhower never fully disappeared. Despite their disagreements, the Allies pushed forward. Eisenhower's broad front strategy prevailed, and the war in Europe ended in May 1945. But the cost of division was real. Resources were sometimes wasted, opportunities were missed, trust between American and British commanders remained fragile throughout the campaign. Montgomery believed history would prove him right, that a narrow front could have ended the war sooner and saved lives. Eisenhower believed his cautious, methodical approach prevented disaster. Both men were brilliant in their own ways. Both made decisions they thought were best. But their clashing egos, national pride, and differing philosophies created a hidden battle within the Allied command. In the end, the Allies won the war, but not without paying a price for their internal conflicts. The divide revealed an uncomfortable truth. Even among allies, unity is never guaranteed when ambition and strategy collide. Sometimes the hardest battles are fought not on the front lines, but in the rooms where decisions are made. Montgomery and Eisenhower both wanted victory, but on their own terms. Their clash nearly fractured the Allied command from within. In the end, cooperation won over division, but the scars remained. History remembers their triumph, not their arguments. Yet the lesson is clear. Even the strongest alliances can crack under the weight of ego and ambition. Sometimes the greatest threat doesn't come from the enemy, it comes from within. What do you think? Could Montgomery's plan have worked?